see you guys or my face, but I can hear you, Dr. Hurwitz.
Can we lower it?
Yeah, I'm working on that. First things first.
Okay.
Getting less.
Okay.
Can
So
everyone
talk,
hear me?
talk again, Kim.
Yeah, can everyone hear me okay?
That's better. That's much better. All right, hang on. I had my laptop speaker away.
Gotcha.
Okay. I think
All right.
that's it.
Ready?
We're ready.
We're ready.
Okay, cool. So can you guys see me or just the presentation?
Just a presentation.
Okay, cool.
Okay. See you in the bottom right-hand corner.
Okay, neat, awesome, cool. Alrighty, well, I feel like quite a few of you guys already know who I am. My name's Kim Grog. I'm from Tiffin in my undergrad, and once this is done, I'll be finished with my master's, also in the forensic psych program. Some of you probably are familiar with this presentation. I've presented it a couple of times, but trust me, this will be a completely remixed edition of this presentation because I did a lot more tests and really cleaned up some of my findings thanks to some of the suggestions of Dr. Hurwitz and Dr. Victor. So we'll go ahead and get started because I'm always really bad with time. So I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as possible so I can get to a lot of feedback and questions because I think that'll benefit everyone in this situation. So. My presentation is called Sex Sells or Does It? And this is a huge project. To summarize it, it would be something that you could call a comparative empirical analysis. So just some background with regards to what my topic is. The overarching theme would be twofold, not only sexual harassment in the workplace, but also specifically talking about the Me Too movement. I got my Me Too movement shirt on that I wear every time I present this, and we'll get into that a lot more in detail. But before we can talk about what the Me Too movement was and how it impacted sexual harassment, I think it's important to define sexual harassment. Which across the board, there's quite a few definitions, but to summarize it, it's very much so just the unwanted gestures, conversations, actions, and a sexual nature. And that is defined by the person, a reasonable person. If someone might not consider something uncomfortable or unwanted, but another person would. It's at the discretion of that individual, but it's to be respected in that opinion. This could create intimidating, hostile, or humiliating environments. Sexual harassment doesn't have to be within a workplace. This could be in a movie theater, this could be at a bar, but I'm going to specifically talk about employees, customers, consumers of more so in a workplace setting. Sexual harassment is very present in workplaces. However, there is quite a bit of a dark figure of crime or a dark figure of unreported harassment even within a workplace. Of the people who are reporting, more often than not, females, about 80% of females are going to be victimized or potentially victimized by their coworkers or have identified that. And surprisingly, the presence now is about 70% of males are able to come forward and talk about being harassed by their coworkers. There are about over half the idea. It's hard to research things like this because, again, it's one of those things that is based on your own kind of opinion and discretion on what is something that's unwanted and inappropriate, as well as things have to be reported to be able to be documented. But the best guess is that about over half, or about 58% of women experience unwanted or inappropriate sexual advances while working over their lifetime. And the research specifically focuses on people 18 to 65. So that's even before that first high school, maybe McDonald's job or something like that. Another thing to consider is that in 2017, there were a little less than 7,000 charges to the United States Employment Commission regarding sexual harassment, but that does not consider all the claims that went unreported. I mentioned unreported or the dark figure crime a couple of times already in the seconds that I've been speaking, and the reality is, specifically with regards to any sort of sexual misconduct, whether it's something just like a joke or a inappropriate smelling of hair or something like that, or it can be so much more than that. Sexual crimes are probably the most unreported crime or concern, and such is true also with sexual harassment in the workplace, because a lot of people don't know what sexual harassment even is, or what they can do to report it. Where does that report go? Who listens to me when I report that? And this isn't just in a workplace setting. 75% of students who were surveyed in a recent study in 2015 didn't know their campus resources with regards to reporting sexual harassment under Title IX. Another really big concern when it comes to reporting is the stigma and gender concerns. Males are going to be far less likely to report sexual harassment than females. But this is improving over time. Since a study that was done in 2004, there was a 62% increase in male claims since 1992. So we're making some progress even in the 11 years between when that study was initially done to comparing it to later. But there's still work to be had to break the barrier and encourage males to identify sexual harassment, whether that's from another male coworker or a female coworker or someone who doesn't have a gender identity that they've chosen. Some other things that really impact someone's ability to identify sexual harassment is fear of pressure or retaliation, or for it to completely damage their job. I'm a big Monica Lewinsky fan. One of the reasons why that continued as long as it did is the political pressure that was involved in the incident. The population that's probably most affected by sexual harassment would be twofold. The first is interns. It's likely an unpaid role, but they have shown to be experiencing higher rates of harassment and far less likely to report for fear of maybe not getting that job or not getting a great reference or ability to get another job because of reporting something like that. And the second one is women in male-dominated fields like engineering, things like that, even in majors, like while they're in college, have experienced more sexual harassment, more need to prove themselves, have to be subjected to more crude jokes than others. My project specifically focuses on comparing the United States to Canadian expectations for their country's sexual harassment policies. So generally, they are very similar. They sound kind of the same in the fact that both the United States and Canada both have federal requirements of how employees are expected to hold their employees accountable. The United States identifies that there are 3 forms of sexual harassment: unwanted sexual attention, sexual coercion, and gender harassment. This is very similar to that of the Canadian Code, which identifies that sexual harassment can be any conduct, comment, gesture, or contact of a sexual nature that was intentionally causing offense or humiliation. Interestingly enough, in 2020, they actually updated the Canadian Code and they added a bill, Canadian 65, which required even that much more mandatory training for both the employers and the employees underneath them. And they've invested over $50 million into funding different things with regards to harassment allegations, which is pretty neat. It's brand new. I actually had written most of my literature review and things like that in 2019. I had to make quite a few edits to accommodate the new expectations, the more rigorous expectations of Canadian companies. Why am I wearing this shirt and why is this project even a thing? It's regards to the Me Too movement. I'm super passionate about just the energy that's around this movement that began in 2017 with just a hashtag on Twitter when Alyssa Milano outed the fact that she had been also tormented and tortured and harassed by Harvey Weinstein. He's far from the only individual who is a part of the Me Too movement or has come out as been identified as someone who has been a serial rapist, serial harasser, things like that. But he's probably the most famous, I would say, in the fact that there's about 80 allegations and that much more. He is exactly where he needs to be right now. He's up at Rikers in New York, he will serve the rest of his time in prison, his life in prison, which it seems like it's going to be a pretty short life because he's pretty sick. But nonetheless, I don't want to get on a rabbit trail about Harvey Weinstein. The Me Too movement, like I said, was a social media movement that has now helped shift the culture, not only on social media to encourage women or other individuals who have been harassed to identify that harassment and speak it out by name and speak out against their abuser. But I was hoping to see that it has helped shift the culture within environments of workplace settings and just culture in general. And I was hoping to see what that did. So we'll see here in a second that that wasn't the case that I was able to identify with my research, but I found that much more in other settings. Nonetheless, through the Me Too movement, there has been more conversation about how to improve sexual harassment expectations within a workplace setting. Some of those would be changing the environment and culture altogether by making it more comfortable to talk about topics like these, including more short trainings or dialogues about harassment, or even just comfortably bringing up topics like, hey, I don't know what these gender types are. Can we talk about those so I can accommodate my employees better, or I can make considerations for the different consumers and customers that we're working with that might identify as these different types of genders. Just knowledge is power in all of this, and knowledge is the best way to respect others. Another solution that has come about through the Me Too movement is that punishment must be clear, well-defined, and widely known to help deter people from partaking in habits or actions that are harassing others. This is just a slide that you're more than welcome to take a picture of or get from me later. These are just things if you want to know more about the Me Too movement, but through more of an easy to access, easy to digest cultural setting. These are podcasts, books, and documentaries that I have really enjoyed learning more about just by diving into them. Catch and Kill's a podcast as well as a book that goes into crazy amount of details about the efforts that Harvey Weinstein enlisted to keep this story of the women that he for 30 years tortured under wraps, to catch and kill the story so that no one could find out about it. It's pretty crazy stuff. He even enlisted the Russian mafia. So dive into that if you can, but these other ones are great ones as well. I mentioned all four of these because these are something that you're probably familiar with. You've probably seen it on a Facebook article, or maybe you've watched these documentaries. But it's something to consider the fact that these are all celebrities that were not only conducting themselves in a manner that was inappropriate and criminal, but it was in a workplace setting too. Harvey Weinstein was harassing up-and-coming actresses that were employed by his movie industry. Larry Nassar, which is the Athlete A documentary. Larry Nassar was the Olympic gymnast. Those Olympic gymnastics girls were working. They were trying to make their way into the Olympics or into different competitions and things like that. That was their role. That was their whole livelihood. And they were harassed and assaulted by Larry Nassar in that role. Chasing Cosby is about Bill Cosby. He too, very similar in the Harvey Weinstein. He specifically targeted those who were up and coming, very young, very new to the field of either music or actors. And that was harassing in their workplace setting. You can even look into Raven-Symoné and her coming out against against Bill Cosby while she was working in the Cosby Show at the early age of, I believe, about 12 years old. So she was getting paid to be working on that set. She wasn't being paid to be harassed or subjected to the kind of treatment that he was encouraging and hiding from so many for a long time, not hundreds of years, like 50 years. But more specifically to my presentation and the research that I looked into, the reason I started this project was the hope to see if there was a difference in policy or employee conduct handbook policies between the Me Too movement and before the Me Too movement. So those are the two on the right here. However, as I was diving into this, I quickly discovered that I wanted to look not just only at more updated policies since the Me Too movement, after the Me Too movement, but I wanted to see if maybe there was a difference between type of organization, so type of employer. So I looked at restaurants, corporations, and stores to determine, is there a difference in conduct policy content between organization type, as well as I considered where that country of origin of the headquarters was, both American companies as well as Canadian companies. So I also wanted to see if there was a difference in content and quality between locations. I had a lot of theories and a lot of hypotheses. Some were true, some were not. I was very optimistic and very bright-eyed and bushy-tailed to believe that the Me Too movement would have a huge positive impact on companies and have really helped revitalize and change company policies. I also had the expectation that Canadian companies would just have overall better, more positive policies. And I wasn't really sure if there'd be any difference between company type. I didn't really think that there would be much of a difference between if it was a restaurant versus a store and things like that. I learned a lot from these hypotheses. Some were true, some were far from that. So this here is more of a visual of the empirical questions. So my variables were American and Canadian. So obviously that would be the country of organization headquarters. And then the other one was the type of organization. So I looked at 10 restaurants of American origin, 10 restaurants of Canadian origin, 10 corporations American, 10 Canadian, 10 American stores, and 10 Canadian stores. I had to find policies that were Canadian that were in English. A lot of them were in French, and I wasn't going to waste Dr. Victor's time of translating those. So it took me a little while to find some of those, but I was able to do so. So I analyzed a total of 60 policies. This is a 2x3 factorial between and within persons, non-repeated mixed measures design. That's all to say I compared each of these boxes to each other and within each other. My goal was to also analyze the Me Too movement, so policies that have been updated since 2017 and policies before 2017. But to my depression, to my sadness, I was not able to find many policies available online or that had been published after 2017. So there wasn't enough to even have statistical power in my analysis. I did a couple internal tests and things like that later on with time, and I wasn't able to find that there was any significant tests that were findings that were because of time or comparing more recent policies to older policies, believe it or not. So I looked at 60 employee handbooks. So it was 60 companies. I found all the policies online. I printed them out. And those were all available. I didn't contact any company to get access to it. I didn't go to all these stores. I didn't work at all these places. They were available online. And I utilized a worksheet that I used for every single one of the policies to answer the same objective questions on each of them so that I could put them into my data, which I'll show you here in a second. Because I didn't use any persons, I didn't use a questionnaire and meet with individuals for this, there was no consent form required because I was going to get this from archival data that anyone could have access. You could Google the Google policy and it'll pop right up. My worksheet focused on the 4 dependent variables that I had, 5 if you count time, which I then kind of just nixed because it didn't really work out for me. The other one was policy content. I wanted to see if all the policies held up to the standards of what their country of origin's federal policy required of them. So United States Federal Code requires 5 different sort of bullet points for each of an American policy to be held to the right standard. If not, it's an illegal policy and it breaks federal employment commission rules. And there are 9 requirements of Canadian policies for the code in Bill 65 within that code. So I made sure, checked them off the list. Okay, this includes this policy, this includes this expectation, this includes things like unanimous reporting was something that was required for both policies, both federal expectations. The other thing that I looked at was policy quality, which included 2 different sorts of variables. I looked at ideal policy content, which are things that are just good to have in a policy to make it more employee-centered and more survivor-centered. So things like if you have experienced sexual harassment, having resources for survivors like counseling may be available, or providing a telehealth service so that individuals can talk to someone about what happened. Anonymous reporting, an 800 number that's anonymous. And then another ideal, but it sounds like it should be required everywhere, is a detailed step of what does the reporting process look like? What does the investigation process look like? What am I walking into by being brave enough and having the courage enough to speak up against something? The other one is total quality, which considers all the other, it's total. It's all of the other variables combined. So it considers the ideal policy content, nationally required content, and the sanction deterrent impact. The last one, like I said, is sanction deterrent impact or policy enforcement. I don't know about you guys, but I've never committed murder because I know that that might lead to the death penalty for me. So, I mean, and for other factors too, but not only with crimes, but also with conduct within a company, the more specific you can be with what could happen to you if you commit a certain action or a certain offense, the more you know what could happen as a result of that, what kind of sanctions, punishments, and consequences can be there, really helps deter you from even considering doing that act. Such is true with sexual harassment. So now we get to the fun stuff. I'm gonna keep boring you, but we'll get to the graphs here in just a second. Just some summary information of some things that I found interesting. This wasn't something that was like an empirical finding or anything, but there were only, of the 60 policies I analyzed, 5 of the companies had a female CEO or head of company. Another one is that just across the board, this was similar to what I expected for my hypotheses. Canadian companies trumped over American policies when it came to weighing the different statistical findings. There were 14 statistically significant findings that favored Canadian companies, as opposed to only 2 when you compare the 2 of them that favored American policies. So they have some strength in ours. Another is that Canadian companies ranked higher on average on both sets of variables, both the total quality and ideal policy content. One of the ideal policy content little notes that I think is super interesting is that Bell Mobility, which is a cell phone company, they provided a provision that allowed for mental health care to all individuals, and then underneath that they had a specific stipulation that encouraged those who were reporting misconduct, who had experienced it, that they should consider utilizing the service. So I thought that was a really neat way to help bridge the gap and like break the stigma and encourage the employees to do something about their mental health or do something about reporting. Even interestingly enough, I compared some policies, some companies that were both American and Canadian. So there's Buffalo Wild Wings in both America and in Canada. And even that much within those 2, the Canadian policy was more beefy. It had more information. And the Canadian policy obviously met the Canadian federal requirements, not just the 5 stipulations in American policy. The original catalyst, so the reason why I did this research and opened this can of worms to do this project, was to see how the Me Too movement impacted expectations for employees. And I was not able to render a single finding statistically from that. So that was pretty humbling. I don't know if you're allowed to use phones in class today since it's so unique, but if you are allowed to use your phones today, this is a QR code that gives you the ability to scan your phone, your camera, and you just go up to the screen and you can get to my results and graphs, because I am not going through all of mine. I did 96 tests, probably more than that. And of those 96 tests, I found 41 statistically significant findings. And I was not going to bore you guys with 41 charts and graphs in here. So if you are able to use your QR code and able to scan that, pages 6 through 13 go through a detailed description of each of my dependent variables. I did so in a very quick manner just a second ago, but if you want to understand more of how I was able to refine the variable of ideal policy content or things like that, you can go to pages 6 through 13. If you want to see all my graphs, like I said, there are one of them. That's 13 through 14 of the you scan a QR code.
All right, I have to stop you right there.
Yeah.
This is because for someone like me, this is like magic. Okay. So I want to know how you did that. That's amazing, Kim.
Google Docs has an add-on. So I was, I am not a person that's typically online like this, and I wanted to be able to give you guys all the papers that I have to show you. So I figured I was like, how on earth can I give them what I want to give them still? So this was my way of doing that. So feel free to open up your camera app if you're allowed to in class. I know that it's a little tricky with Dr. Herbert and cell phones. And then you just take a picture, you just scan it, and it should go right to my reference paper.
So seriously, how did you take 8 pages?
Google Docs will let you. There's like, how there's like add-ons, like almost like an app that you can get within Google Chrome.
Okay.
They have a QR code app, so I just put the link into my Google Doc reference page, and then it made this image.
That's the coolest thing I've ever seen. Oh, with this the hair on the eye of the sword? Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, just let me know when I can switch it to the next one once everyone's able to get up.
It worked on my phone.
Good. Okay, yeah. So 6 through 13 is the descriptions, and then 13 through 49, and probably that much more. On a phone, it might look a little bit different orientation-wise, but I figured it's something nice to have those in your hand. So is it okay if I move on?
Yeah. Anybody else?
Alrighty. So here are some big picture findings. These are findings that I had. I analyzed it from a couple different places. So I conducted 17 tests under the organization type. So comparing restaurants, corporations, and stores. And I found 8 findings to be statistically significant. And I'm going to show you on the next screen here the ANOVA test, which is the test of variance for both the sanction and deterrent impact and quality. So basically what that means is that when you consider organization types, corporations, restaurants, and stores of both locations, across the board, restaurants were just crazy. They were so much more accommodating, or required employees to be that much more on top of things. But when it came to the deterrent impact, restaurants of both American and Canadian companies were so much more descriptive of this could happen to you, this could happen to you, you could be terminated, you could get demoted, you could be transferred, than both corporations and stores. This was found to be just at the 0.03 level. So you can see that in the graph, the top one on the left, on the right. The next is the total quality. So that considers the 3 factors of sanction, deterrent impact, ideal policy content, and national required. And this allows us to see that stores, both American and Canadian policies, were really behind all. They aren't as strong in any of those 3 other categories of sanction deterrent, nationally required, and ideal policy content in corporations and restaurants. I'm not this, so that's what I found the 3 of them. Going back to this here, because I'm a very visual person, I like to keep scrolling through. You see a bunch more. So that's just the variance test. I supplemented the variance, the ANOVA test, with both the post-hoc test to show which ones were statistically different, but then also I went through and I analyzed each bit by bit, and so I compared restaurants to corporations, restaurants to stores, corporations to stores for each of these. And if you pull up the QR code, you can see each of those individual tests, and trust me, there are plenty. The one I think is the most fun, and where I'll probably spend a little bit more time, is the fact that Canadian companies I compared to American companies. I actually had the privilege to go with Dr. Victor to Canada and present this project to them in Montreal. And I've actually done more tests than even when I presented it then. Of the 45 tests I ran, 16 were found to be significant. One of those would be the ANOVA test of variance, showing that the Canadian policy had more considerations for ideal policy content than American policies. So you can see this image here shows Canadian policy outweighing American policies. One of the reasons that they have a stronger average in this group is a lot of the Canadian policies included expectation and allowance for not only online anonymous reporting, but over the phone anonymous reporting, as well as a lot more of them included specific details on who do I report to? Do I report any sexual harassment claims to my boss? Do I report it to a coworker? They were far more specific in that than in many of the American policies. They're a little bit more general in those settings. Another one to consider is just internal within Canadian companies. For my thesis, I added all Canadian companies. When I initially presented this research in probably March of 2019, I only analyzed the 30 American companies. So comparing external American companies, in addition, since I began my focus, as well as just the 30 internal Canadian companies. I had done the 30 American companies previous. Of the Canadian companies, 10 of those were significant. The variance tests that had significant were both nationally required and total quality. So I'll go to that now. Oops. Yeah. Okay. So, like I said earlier, restaurants were just on everything. They were far above the others, and I think that was because restaurants not only need to have respect with their coworkers and their staff that they're working with, but they have a huge expectation on their backs to be respectful to the consumers that are in their restaurants, because that's dependent on their tips and things like that. So it maybe comes with more of an expectation that they have to be on their game. That's just my idea. Within this, though, Canadian restaurants, more of the federal required documents or elements than stores. On top of that, they also had a higher total quality. I think that's also because of the fact that the bottom line is nationally required. If it's a 1 of 100, that means that all 10 of the Canadian corporations met all the federal standards. 86 for the Canadian stores. There were 4 of the Canadian stores that were federal requirements. So I felt that I was obligated to let the Canadian government know that there were some companies lacking behind the federal standards. Same thing for American companies. Sadly, there are a lot more American companies that meet the standards, and there were less standards even. One of the results I found was inside the variance test American policy that American restaurants, probably getting tired of me saying that, had higher from impact. We were specific this is going to happen to you who are engaging in this sort of action in both American stores and American corporations. This is the one that was right on the cusp. This was my .05 question. But in the you can find my paper and my full paper coming soon, you will see that there are so many more topics that were rendered significant as well. The way you can even substantiate a test of variance is doing those each individual tests as well to see the strength of it. And there was quite a bit of strength within each of those comparisons. But I did a total of 96 tests, like I said, 41 were found to be significant. So about 42% of my findings of my tests were rendered significant. So I'm sorry to anyone who is editing or reading through this paper. It's right now about 26 pages, and I'm sure that there'll be plenty more additions after the finishing of this presentation, because I'm sure you guys have a lot of feedback. Those were some of the big picture findings that I had. But based on those and many more that were included in the paper, I was able to draw some conclusions about things that were lacking or shown to be really important based on not only the literature review, but the findings that I had. And these are things to consider within your own place of business, places that you're applying to in the future as well. Or if maybe you're the one making these decisions at a company someday, it's important to consider them. Including suggestions on how to support employees who have experienced harassment is huge. If that's even just a roundtable discussion about harassment, or if that's in a sense providing counseling or providing like business cards for counselors in the area, that would be great. Training on sexual harassment should be short, frequent, and interactive. I know that in the times that we live in, with Zoom being a lot of how we do a lot of our things, interaction is huge on that to keep people engaged in that time. But the shorter and more possible, the more engaged you're going to be. If it's a 3-hour presentation, like I could probably give on this topic, you're going to listen to the first 10 minutes and then really check out. And it's going to not have the amount of strength and importance that it should. Another thing is that anonymous reporting is huge. If fear of retaliation leads someone to not report crime, that's a problem. So helping rid that barrier of the fear of retaliation is through anonymous reporting and making that accessible at all institutions. Another one is to make your expectations of what could happen or the sanctions that could happen to you if you are in part of any sort of inappropriate behavior. That should be clear, specific, and well-defined. Dispute resolution, and it wasn't discussed previous, but dispute resolution should be described in detail in the policies. So this is meaning, does your company require you to sign a non-disclosure agreement? Does your company require you to not post on social media if there's agreements? What does that look like? What kinds of ways are they going to handle a situation? Are they going to require you to not speak about it? Are they going to require you to utilize a third-party attorney, an HR program, things like that? The more you know, the better. And then detailing who am I going to report to? Who's going to be investigating or listening to my claim or following through with it is important. Because if I'm being sexually harassed by my boss, but I'm supposed to report and that will be investigated by my boss, I'm not going to report him or her. But if I know that I can go to a third-party HR office down the road or in a different department in my office building, I'm going to be far more comfortable because that's not my direct boss and my direct abuser. So that's pretty important. But you have to also know those people to be comfortable with it. So having interpersonal training on who each other are in your organization is important as well. There's a billion things I want to continue to do with this. The biggest one is, are these policies that I analyze, are these organizations practicing what they're preaching? Hopefully some of them aren't because they weren't that great of policies, but the policies that I considered to be star students, which I'll go through here in a second because that's pretty fun. I want to know if the culture within that organization is the accommodating as the paper that they're saying that they are? Does their policy consider these things and really encourage people to report, but the culture within their institution not really encourage that? So I would love to do some interviews with those individuals. The other thing is I would love to consider different kinds of organizations like college campuses, sports teams, military branches, attraction industries, and I was even now just thinking like law enforcement and things like that. The other one is to conduct a public perception study on what they understand or what they believe about sexual harassment, what they believe about how often it is occurring, and how likely they would be to report it. Because I'm really curious on how that is applied in real life. And no project is without stumbling blocks. I'm sure that you guys have experienced that or will experience that. I definitely hit plenty of barriers along my time. The biggest one was that I was unable to accommodate my original expectations. I wasn't able to, find some of the specific policies I wanted. I really wanted to look at restaurants, like Hooters, Tilted Kill, Twin Peaks, places that are known for over-sexualizing or hypersexualizing individuals. I also would love to have found access to civil and criminal charges or claims, reports, allegations relating to sexual harassment for each of these companies to compare what their policy says to what the prevalence is. But that is not accessible online. They try to keep that stuff under wraps. And then another thing that was really difficult was shifting from opinion to fact. So if you go to the end of the reference paper that you guys might have access to, still on the image, the QR code thing, is that I really wanted to make sure that total quality didn't sound like it was just my opinion. I'm like, oh yeah, that looks pretty good. That looks pretty good. But doing so in a way that was super objective. So I had to define some really specific operational definitions to make it as systematic as possible so that I was grading the first company I considered as equally and as with a fine-tooth comb as I did the last one. So that was difficult at first, but I really think I did do a pretty decent job at working to shift from opinion to fact. So I know I talked really fast, and I know that was a very quick summary of the 126 pages of content that I have, but that is where I want to leave us so that I have a lot of time for discussion and questions, but I don't honestly know how much time I've used. So if someone can interject with that and with any questions or feedback, that would be great.
First of all, fantastic job.
Thank you.
And personally, I want to thank you for restoring integrity to the idea of content analysis. We've seen that somewhat bastardized through our years here at Tiffin University. But you did a content analysis for his master's thesis.
Right.
Warm spot in my heart for a good content analysis.
Thank you.
I got a few questions, but we'll open it up. Anybody have a question? Want to ask? So one of the things that I was thinking of as you're going through this was how easy was it for you to find these policies? I know a lot of companies like to hide things and not make it easy to find. So how easy was it for you to find the policies?
It wasn't easy to find Canadian policies because I was familiar with the companies. I didn't know 10 restaurants off the top of my head that had headquarters in Canada. And it's not as easy to Google Canadian headquartered restaurants as you would think it would be. And then as I was finding them, as people were suggesting them to me or I was finding them online, one, I had to dig up the policy if I could find it. And two, I had to pray it was in English, not French. Another thing was that I was trying as unbiased with my selection of these groups or these companies as possible because I didn't want to just be like, well, these are my favorite places to eat or these are my favorite places to shop and really look at it that way. One, because I'd be biased, but then two, I also never want to go to that store again if their policy was awful. So I didn't want it to be ruined for me. But nonetheless, what I did to do it was I just spent a lot of time on Google and I created a structure to help parallel companies so that I was comparing things that were interrelated. So I did not only the corporations, restaurants, and stores, but I would Google, I had 2 fast food companies from both American and Canadian policies. I had 2 pharmacies, so I did CVS and Walgreens for American companies, and I did 2 pharmacies for Canadian ones. So I just would keep Googling. Once I was able to structure the American ones last March, I was able to go in and be like, okay, Kim, you said that you wanted to look at 2 cell companies for Canadian corporations. So I just kept Googling Canadian cell phone companies until I found 2 policies. So it took quite a bit of time, but nonetheless, there were 60 and probably that much more policies available online. I did find 60 though, finally. It took a little while. Any other questions?
Did you hear that question?
No. Go ahead.
I'm not hearing sound again.
I have a question.
Hi.
Hello. My question is, what's the most exciting part of this research?
I think the most exciting part of this research for me was finding that there are a lot of companies that really care about people. There are companies that encourage counseling, that encourage alternatives, provided even like medical support or leave if you were experiencing issues and things like that. So I was really encouraged. There are companies that care. I think that as we continue to look into this, and as we continue to go into the world that we live in now, I'm going to even that much more look forward and look into the policies of places I'm applying to or places that I'm working. So I'd say that was the most exciting. Was just I'm more of a educated consumer and educated employer.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
You have another one here.
Yeah.
Did you look at policies from the same company, but in different states to look at how policies differ based on state and local laws?
So no, I looked at the federal standards. It would have been really neat to compare like North versus South or things like that, like regions in America, to consider things like that. And maybe the combination, like the Dunkin' Donuts Massachusetts policy was more accommodating than maybe a Alabama or a Georgia policy. Yeah, no, I would have loved to have done that. It would have just been too specific. I was already broad in my scope, so that it would have been a lot more, a lot more to look at.
So, do you feel that this was a lot too much? What do you think?
It was a lot. I would say it wasn't too much in the sense that I had chunks of it. I had done the 30 in March of 2019, finished it before that first semester ended, so I had already done the 30. And I did bite off a lot by adding another 30 companies to analyze, get the information from, and then do all the research in. But I'm really thankful for it. And that led us to going to Canada and eating a bunch of yummy food and stuff. So it all worked out. I wouldn't say it was too much. I would say it's too much in the sense that now I have all these other rabbit trails of other places I want to go with it, and not enough time, motivation, or means to do so.
So you started off, you said your motivation for this was the Me Too movement.
Mm-hmm.
You wanted to see it change, right? And you found it didn't change. So that implies there was a need to change. So as you look through these policies, I know you gave a bunch of recommendations, but as you examine these policies, did you find things that you would have expected to change given the Me Too movement? Or maybe things were already in place and didn't need to change?
That's a good question. A lot of them were better off than I thought that they would be. And so, yeah, less of a need to change from some of them. But again, that goes to practice in application versus what's in their documentation and what's in their handbook. But some of the things that were really surprising that still need to change are the amount of policies that weren't meeting their federal standards. I don't know if you guys know the Southern grocery store Winn-Dixie. Love Winn-Dixie. However, they only met 2 of the 5 federal standards of what they needed to have inside a employee handbook. So those are things that need to change, not only because of the Me Too movement and need to make the conversation more open and accessible to talk about harassment, but also from just the fact that like that's blatantly not upholding federal expectations. But there were plenty of policies that were published before 2017 and before the Me Too movement really got energized that included things like anonymous reporting and included things that I would have hoped to have seen after the Me Too movement. So yeah, that's true. Like, some of them, maybe the reason why I was disappointed that the Me Too movement didn't change anything is there was less to change than I thought.
You're planning on doing a thesis? Any words of advice or inspiration?
Never be afraid to ask questions. That's the biggest advice. Find ways to continue to like have milestones or be motivated after you are done with your initial project to continue to work on it. Because I could have definitely probably been at this point a long time ago. I just needed to get myself more motivated. So I'm thankful that today came to continue to motivate me to finish my paper. And then my other biggest advice is just to dream big, because this is a pretty cool day. Like, it's cool to be able to present this and know it as well as I do and things like that. So just stay open-minded to the fact that, like, if you want to make it happen, it'll happen. You just got to work for it.
Did you find that presenting at the international conference really helped you?
Oh yeah. One, that was a big milestone. Like, I wouldn't have worked on my thesis while I was in the hardest semester of, well, I guess it wasn't the hardest, it is for you guys this year, the fall is. I wouldn't have worked on my thesis while I was still in my last semester of undergrad as much, of grad as much, had I not had Montreal in November. So I definitely think it helped me, and not only in the sense of, I had another presentation on my resume, I had another time to be comfortable presenting, but it also helped me in the sense that it helped kick me into gear and really hyperdrive getting some of these policies analyzed and all the tests done for it.
You're gonna go on?
Yeah, I think so. I think I want to get my PhD.
You have your dissertation already written.
Yeah, no kidding.
I hope so. We're getting there.
This is like a dissertation.
All right, thanks, Kim. Great job.
Yeah, you guys, I really appreciate it. So what do I do now? Do I stop sharing? Let's see. Stop sharing. Okay.